So thank you very much for joining us today. I'm Parvolden, Managing Director of Mobility Network, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the first in this season of The Way Forward 2023. Before we start, I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Forward, there we are. Mobility Network at the School of Cities is an institutional strategic initiative at the University of Toronto. 2 years ago, U of T recognized that the sustainable movement of people and goods is a global challenge that can only be addressed by a cross-disciplinary collaboration among university researchers and further through collaboration with public partners in government and industry. Mobility Network, a group of 70 researchers from across U of T's 3 campuses whose diverse interests span the broad scope of critical issues about mobility, is the University of Toronto's answer to that grand challenge. We've organized that broad expertise into what we call 7 knowledge clusters. Of course, everything is connected to everything else, but this organizing principle shows our focus on the key challenges, areas like equity and inclusion, land use planning and economy, climate change, health, merging new mobility technologies and services, and of course, freight and urban goods movement. We wrap that in the green circle about behavioral analysis and modeling to remind us that mobility, accessibility, transportation is about people. And we need to understand who these people are and what they're trying to achieve by moving around in our city, our region, nationally and internationally. And then we wrap that in the outer circle because of course we have to, we acknowledge that we operate within the constraints that are proposed by our natural environment, by our built environment, and by the governance environment in which we operate. Welcome to the first of 6 planned panels that will run from today and then every other Tuesday until mid-June. We're starting with a panel discussion on adapting to changing travel behavior in the post-COVID city. And with that, I will pass it off to Eric Miller, our moderator.
Thank you, Judy, and welcome everyone. I just want to let everybody know that this event is being recorded and will be shared after the fact. I am Eric Miller, a professor in the Department of Civil and Mineral Engineering, and I'm the director of Mobility Network. As Judy has already indicated, I'm also the moderator of today's panel, which we're calling Adapting to Changing Travel Behavior in the Post-COVID City. Our collective demand for travel is generated by the cumulative decisions made by each of us concerning our daily out-of-home activities. Do I go into the office to work today, or do I work from home? In either case, do I go shopping at a bricks and mortar store or order things online? We used to do this sort of a panel session in person. Today, we're all gathering on Zoom. Pre-COVID, our travel patterns were at least somewhat predictable, but now the way forward is much less certain. Our 3 panelists are here to bring their perspectives to a discussion about our travel habits in the post-pandemic city. Where are we now? Where might we be heading, and what this may mean for our future travel demand. They are each going to take a few minutes to bring their perspectives to this discussion. Then I'll moderate a panel discussion, and then we'll follow that with a bit of Q&A from the audience. In order to submit your questions, please use the chat. The chat is configured so that you can message me directly. I'll sort through the questions and try to assemble them and use the time available to ask as many questions as we can to our panelists. I'll introduce each of the panelists in their turn just before they speak. I'm going to begin with Wendy. Wendy Reuter. Reuter is the head research and analytics at Toronto Transit Commission, the TTC. For the past 3 years, that research and analytics has kept TTC informed about changing ridership patterns. Wendy has over a decade of experience in the passenger transportation industry. Prior to joining the TTC, Wendy held several senior management roles at the Canadian Urban Transit Association. Today, Wendy is going to bring us up to date with the current state of play of transit ridership in the city. Over to you, Wendy.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for that introduction, Eric and Judy. That gave a little bit of background about me and what I'd planned to talk about today. In fact, I did want to start a little bit with CUDA. As Eric mentioned, I had been there just prior to TTC. which happened to be just before COVID. And the Canadian Urban Transit Association, of course, it's got this national perspective and was able to see a broad number of issues of transit across the country and, of course, internationally as well. And saw sort of this transition of the transit industry from focused on transit operations to this kind of those broader ideas about supporting integrated mobility across communities, and that quite appealed to my work. While I was there, there's quite a history there and breadth across the country, but was able to access a number of prior documents and was looking at some chairs' comments about in opening for a national conference. And the chair opened their comments with some observations about the challenges ahead. The challenges ahead had to do with congestion and congestions in the cities and how transit could be positioned to better support the mobility needs within their communities. And this was to an audience across the country. Ironically, that opening presentation was from 1953. So, so these questions about how do we think about mobility at pivotal points in our history extends well beyond the questions that we have here today. So maybe some opportunities to learn from those places as well. But what I did want to bring forward today is to start off our conversation is a bit of share some information with all of you where we're seeing mobility in Toronto specifically through the lens of transit and what we've been able to observe through COVID and kind of use that information to set a bit of a conversation to this discussion about where the path forward. So Judy, if you could bring up the next slide, just a bit of background on what we've seen in terms of travel demand from a transit perspective since before COVID and through COVID and to where we are now. The way this is a regular tool we've been using throughout COVID at TTC, and over on the left is where we saw travel demand on transit prior to COVID. It's way over January of 2020. And you see the various stages of where demand has been overall and by our various modes throughout COVID to where we are today. And actually that very last marker is as of last week. And so we currently see ridership and travel demand on transit at about 70%, really varies by mode. And I think we're going to get into a bit of discussion about where some of those modes are taking people as well. Just for a bit of reference and context, we're paying attention to what's happening with congestion as well across the city at different times of day, at different times throughout this period. And you might remember some really wonderful times throughout COVID when we were having to stay home a lot, but occasionally need to travel out. And sometimes we would travel by automobile as opposed to transit. And it was fairly easy flowing on the roads. And so this is what we're reading in these congestion markers of AM peak times and the PM peak times and how they compare to normal flow. And I wonder if anyone can anticipate what the congestion markers are now. It's a little blank above there, but I'll ask Judy to give one more click and bring that up. And so we can see that the congestion markers at AM peak times and PM peak times are getting very close to where they were before COVID. Next slide, please, Judy. So the other thing that we've been endeavoring to really understand during COVID, this has become so much more important and evident. Eric had mentioned that when we thought about demand previously, we had certain ways to think about forecasting it, and it was very linear. And that's not at all what we saw during COVID. The needs of customers changed during COVID. Different types of customers were traveling at different times, different periods, and their needs emerged differently. This is just to give a comparison of the types of travel that we saw our customers using transit for before COVID. And on average, there'd be about 3.2 million boardings a day. You can see the range of trip types that customers would take using transit. And that 2.2 number of boardings per day is currently now about 2.3. So it's changed a bit since September of 2022. But the proportion, what's really interesting here is that the proportion of trip types have changed. And what we're seeing is that of the professional workers, of the general office workers, they're making up over 500,000 fewer boardings a day than they did prior to the pandemic. The other 400,000 boardings are spread that are not occurring right now are spread through all of the rest of the trip types, so it's more distributed. But there's a group that really aren't traveling the way that they used to. Next slide, please, Judy. So we also, I thought this would be interesting to show as well in terms of like the types of trips that take place in Toronto. Of course, many of the trips are coming from outside of Toronto. That's these taller bars that represent all trips. And the three over on the left are representing before COVID. And the types of trips that we would see overall, the proportion of transit being about 25% of all trips, and the proportion of transit in the downtown core being about 51% of all trips. You know, fast forward to where we are now, and we see those proportions have shifted. The overall volumes have shifted, and the proportion that are on transit have shifted. Lastly, just wanted something provocative in terms of how we're seeing some travel behaviors change in terms of day of week preference. Prior to the pandemic, you know, travel varied by day. A little bit of variation from Monday to Friday in terms of what we might think of as a commuter travel pattern. And that started to emerge differently as we emerged from the pandemic. Certain days of the week became preferred in different ways. In fact, we've seen Thursdays peak as high as 105% of preference in different months. It's really varied as people have resumed traveling again and selecting the days that they'll move around to where we are in March, and seeing that Monday still remains the least preferred day. Surprisingly, Friday has emerged as a day that's more preferred than it was even before the pandemic. So one of the things that we've been taking from this is that the travel patterns aren't stable. The needs of our customers have changed. We've used data in ways that we never needed to prior to the pandemic to really understand how our customers are traveling, who's traveling, what their characteristics are, the trip types that they want to be taking. And as we look forward to the future, we're realizing that the ways of how we modeled and thought about travel demand and forecasting previously aren't going to meet the needs going forward. The composition is shifting and it's still unpredictable. We're going to have to be thinking really broadly about the tools and the resources we use for forecasting demand going forward. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Wendy. And so now we'll move on to our second speaker, who's Professor Khandker Nurul Habib, who's the Percy Edward Hart Professor in the Department of Civil and Mineral Engineering. He uses behavioral models to ascertain how people move from one location to another and the multiple ways in which people respond to changes in the urban infrastructure. For the past 3 years, Habib's research interests have included studying the impacts of COVID-19 on travel behavior. Today, Habib is going to talk about the many ways people's demand for travel has changed and what that means for the future of travel behavior in the region. Over to you, Habib.
Thank you very much, Eric, for the introduction. And thank you, Wendy, for presenting such an informative the discussion. I agree all of the points you discussed so far. So I'm going to talk about some behavioral understanding and some theory and some practical aspect of it. The main target of this discussion today is the changes in travel behavior. You know, travel behavior is shaped by contexts, and the context provides opportunity and constraints. Because the COVID-19, the context changed. Context changed in many ways, and people also got a huge shock in terms of behavioral shock we talk about. The context change affects the changes in the demand. So what we see on the road today is the resultant of the behavior of people doing different parts of the city. So what are the contexts changed during the COVID and the post-COVID? The fundamental aspect of changing context is telecommuting. People got exposed to the reality of telecommuting, and that was the biggest natural experiment one could ever think about. So it allowed people to see, well, telecommuting can work. Also the e-shopping. So changes in behavior is fundamentally driven by the telecommuting and e-shopping. And as you can understand, majority of people are not working 5 days a week. Working in sense, commuting to the office locations. Telecommuting is still being practiced by many people as widely as possible. So it changes the way we plan our week. It changes the way we lead our days in a particular way. So, and it's not gonna change overnight. It will take time to settle down. In the short or medium run, my understanding out of the research we've been doing is that people will continue practicing telecommuting. And for better or worse, it will shape the travel demand in shape towards the direction we do not always expect. For example, during the COVID, people did use their private car, and it does reduce the sensitivity of driving, and people's guilty feelings of driving actually eroded a bit. It also moved people away from transit, and people got used to not to use transit. That is also a negative thing. And in these two contextual experience, the practice of telecommuting is creating a situation where travel behavior is shifted towards micromobility and more independent way of movement. We also see during COVID, the Uber and those type of shared mobility services got a dip in their service demand, but I'm hoping and I believe that's also picking up again. So what we are looking at now, since people are not commuting on a daily basis, the demand for transit is taking the shock from that end. Now, what happens, if people are not working in their office place, if they're working at home, it opens up the day. And the working at home, all you know about is not necessarily like continuous work. So people's day are becoming more complex. So we make a lot of small trips, short trips here and there, and those trips are predominantly made by non-transit modes. And private cars being used heavily. So that is creating challenge and context for transits. And eventually, the things will lead to a direction which is difficult to predict at this moment. Now, what happened during COVID, we thought about, because of relying on private car and because of relying on the telecommuting, people would be shifting or moving away from the city, which we did not see would happen. The first experiment that we did during 2020, early stage of the COVID, we found the people that we surveyed were very enthusiastic about telecommuting. They would be moving out of the city and working remotely from suburbs and not coming too much into the city. That thing did not happen. In reality, we followed them up a year after. We found that behavior settled down a bit. So the expectation and the understanding that we got out of our research is it is not the telecommuting that will cause people to move out of the city. People will still live as the places of the residents they are and enjoy telecommuting and its benefit of it. What will drive the suburbanization is not the telecommuting that much, more so by real estate market. So what does it mean? It has a profound implication to travel behavior. In sense, if people live in the places, if there is not enough of redistribution of residential locations, and then the telecommuting becomes a norm. So we're looking at more complex travel pattern and a lot of trip chaining, a lot of sharing of the mode in-house and out of house. So that led to this situation, which is a bit scary to me in terms of travel model forecasting point of view. So we used to consider commuting as the core and the bone of travel, daily travel demand, and that made our life very easy to predict future. With the context, where there is not so much thing called typical day, and the commuting is not very regular, I think our days are filled with small trips, short trips, chain trips, and so on and so forth. In this context, my understanding that we need to still think carefully about transit services, and transit will face a lot more challenges. Initially, pre-COVID, our investigation showed that the TNC was not a good competitor with transit, which I'm afraid could be in future, because with the short trips and the reasonable distance trip, people will be tempted to use car-based mode, and TNC provides a very viable alternative to them. So maybe we should rethink about the way we provide transit services. We should rethink about the way we should create transit in a multimodal context, where it can be symbiotic to the other modes, especially the on-demand mobility services and non-motorized transportation modes. One interesting anecdotal evidence that I would also like to highlight: during COVID, non-motorized mode, especially biking and walking, has got its demand hiked. But there is a limit to those modes because you cannot walk more than 3 kilometers for most of the time, and you cannot bike more than 5 to 7 kilometers. So the expectation that non-motorized mode will take away the car mode in some context is not really very potential. So what is fearful to me is, in such a mixed situation, maybe transit will face much more challenge from TNC and the taxi type of services. And in this context, I would like to highlight one more thing, is that we saw the one shock, which is COVID, that exposed the reality of telecommuting. What we can expect could be having another shock is automated vehicle technology. So in future, with this experience of telecommuting, with this experience of not relying on the transit, with this experience of flexible office hour, in advent of more widespread application of AV technologies, things could be quite more complicated. So I'm not a pessimistic individual. So I want to be optimistic in the sense that maybe there will be a situation we can drive people's behavior toward more sustainable mode, and we should rethink about what sustainable mode is all about. Is it transit alone, or transit in combination with other modes? We still want people to take transit, and still transit is very important for the growth of the city towards the sustainable directions. But if we stick to the fact that, well, people will come eventually, and to the conventional service plan we do, maybe we need to wait too long. Maybe we should rethink about how should we combine transit in context with the other modes. Maybe we should be rethinking about how cities will be rearrange their land use systems that makes transit more predominant and more competitive. With that, I'm gonna hand over to Eric.
Thanks very much, Habib. Lots to chew on there. Thank you. And so our final of our three panelists is Iain Dobson, who is co-founder of the Strategic Regional Research Alliance. From year 2000, he's developed a world-class real estate data company, and for 25 years prior to that was engaged in the commercial real estate development industry. For almost 3 years, Strategic Regional Research Alliance, or SRRA as we tend to know it, has been tracking the numbers, the news, and the sentiments about the quote-unquote the return to the office through its monthly occupancy index for downtown Toronto. Today, Iain is going to share the lessons learned from the occupancy index and the consultations he's held with local and international stakeholders concerning future directions of travel behavior and city growth. Over to you, Iain.
There we go.
Yeah, that's better.
I managed to unmute myself. Good afternoon, everyone. And I'm going to be talking about two things that I think will help the discussion later. First, the data on the return to work and some of the inputs that we've been receiving since the beginning of the pandemic. And then talk a little bit about what the future looks like in terms of mobility around the workplace and the future of office buildings, and critically, what that means to the ecosystem, the economic ecosystem downtowns, not only here, but around the free world. To begin, at the beginning of the pandemic, the City of Toronto and some executives at the BIAs in Toronto were curious to know what the return to work would look like. And they asked us to start that process. And we found it very, very difficult at the beginning because very few employers, which goes to show you how disruptive the pandemic has been, very few employees kept any records at all about who was coming in or how often they were coming in on a regular basis. This was usually left to group managers and HR specialists and people who were not asking the same questions as we're asking today. So gathering the data in the first place was very, very difficult. We tried to rely on hard reader data from buildings and from other sources of data, but quite frankly, it was very, very difficult. During this period of time, we entered into an awful lot of, and continue, direct interviews with decision makers at many of our major employers in downtown Toronto. And that's unraveled a rather interesting tale. I think we're only halfway through this whole business of managing the remote work and what we call the hybrid model. Habib mentioned that things have changed so rapidly and he doesn't feel that we know where we're going. I couldn't agree more. First, let's have a look at some data. If you could just pop that screen up. By the way, all of this is on our website. Every single report we put out every 2 weeks since the beginning of the pandemic is there. And in each one of our reports, we have a list of links to articles of interest. So please take the opportunity to go and have a look. The first data point that I want to talk, and there's three points, and that is 43%. 43% is the number today of the number of people who would have normally come to their office on a 5-day-a-week basis prior to the pandemic. We calculated at the very beginning of the pandemic, and we had very, very good data to start with, how many people work in offices in downtown Toronto. It's about 440,000 people. And of that, about 23% of them don't normally come to the office in the first place. Holidays, business travel, and so forth. So we created a denominator in this equation that was the number of people that would normally come down on a 5-day-a-week basis. And we're now at that level of 43%. And it's curious, when you overlay our data on the transit data, and also, interestingly enough, sales data and retail shops in downtown Toronto, the curves and the trends are extremely close and very similar. The second data point I'd like to raise with everyone is the fact that of that 43% of people that normalized over 5 days, as much as 65% of those people can come to the office on certain days. And as Wendy so adroitly pointed out in the 5-day work week, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays are now the hot days for attendance in the office. One Thursday in January, we had 65% of people back in the office. The last data point that I'd like to discuss just for a moment and show you is we're thinking it's somewhere around 92 to 93% of all workers in the office space in the downtown Toronto area have come into the office at least once a month. And that data point is an interesting point because it shows that people are coming to the office for some reason or another. And sometimes it's to pick up the mail. In early July, in the first year of the pandemic, people would retrieve the clothing that they left there when they abruptly left in March. I was one of those, picked up my blazer that I hadn't seen for a couple of months. And we've all experienced events like that. But what we're hearing from our interviews is that this hybrid model may not be a permanent solution because there is a growing tension between the needs of employers and the needs of their employees. What we think is a more interesting data point is the discussion on how much remote work will be part of the fabric of working for an employer in essentially what was previously an office-related job. And what we're seeing in that regard is two things. One, productivity is a claim that over 90% of CEOs in one Bloomberg report and one report done by, there's been several. About 90% of employees feel that they're not getting the same productivity as they were before. But interestingly enough, in our interviews, no one really knows how to measure productivity. So I think that's one of those data points out there that is under examination, depends very much on what kind of work you're doing, and it's very much in play. Of course, the other tension is the advantages that employees have had in working at home on a larger scale basis. But at the end of the day, what does it mean for office buildings and the ecosystem in downtown Toronto? I would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about vacancy. Vacancy, as Globe and Mail ran an amazing report this morning saying vacancy's never been higher than 19%. That's not true, but it's very close to it. I think it's important to understand that vacancy in office buildings in Toronto, about 10 to 11% of that vacancy was normal, cyclical oversupply that occurred before the pandemic. The second part of that vacancy issue is the decline in the tech industry and the decline in some industries where people were shrinking as a matter of business recourse. The real issue and the data piece that we're working very hard to try to determine is how much of that vacancy is a direct result of companies who wish to give up space as a result of remote work. And that's still very much something that we haven't really got good data on or a good answer on. And finally, I think the canary in the coal mine for everyone is, will employers continue to lease new space? And what will the look of that space be? Will it be the same kind of offices that were before? And prior to the pandemic, employers were trying to jam as many people as they could into a small amount of space as they could to save money and be more efficient. Clearly, HR people are telling us that's not going to be acceptable in the new world, whatever the new world is. There won't be as much compression of people into space. The space will look differently. But once we see people investing, companies investing in new premises, and we've seen some in new buildings already in downtown Toronto, there's been 5 major deals done that have different look to their space, then we'll be able to understand how many fewer people are coming to the office on a regular basis and into what kind of environment, more or less density. I hope that's a provocative statements for our discussion. And Eric, I turn it back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Iain, and thank you, Habib and Wendy as well. So as almost as inevitable in these things, we're running just a little behind, but we have a fair bit of time for questions. So I think I will actually just start things off. I'm actually going to go directly to the chat. There's a couple of questions that I think are very useful to keep us going or get us started. So David Forsey has a question directed at Wendy to begin with, that I'm curious to hear about the recovery of weekend trips in comparison to weekday and how weekend peaks compared to weekday peaks. We're talking about shifts in travel behavior and all sorts of things. So what's happening on the weekends relative to the weekdays? You're muted.
There we go. All right.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks. No, that's a great question. We very often focus on weekday. We orient that discussion around commuters, but transit is very present in the use of travel around the weekends as well. Just as a comparison, you might think about weekday travel being about 70% of what it was in pre-COVID levels on average. Weekend is between 80 and 85. It really varies. It depends on what's going on in the city. People are using transit if there's activities, and so we see it there. We also see it in the adoption, like of the use of our specialized transit as well. People are using specialized transit to move around. I'd also like to comment on the use during for commuting as well. I know the question was about the weekends. But we talk in averages a lot. But just to give it some context about is transit still, is the core of transit still around commuting? It very much is, even in this moment. 53% of the demand for transit happens during the peak times, and that's what it was before COVID as well. So there's still this real demand around these peak times and sort of similar sorts of travel patterns as we saw before COVID. And the same is true on the weekends, where demand is there. It really fluctuates depending on the activities that are going on in the city.
Okay, and I'm going to follow up, not to pick on you, Wendy, but the also time of day, let's say within the weekday, what's happening AM, PM peaks versus midday? How are we, have there been any changes?
It was really interesting. Earlier in
shifts.
Yeah, earlier in COVID, we saw midday and off-peak times emerge faster than the traditional peak times do. But the traditional peak times have reemerged the same times of day. So 6 to 10 in the morning, 3 to 7, those have emerged. Collectively, they do make up 53% of all of the demand that we see right now, which is about the same percentage that we saw prior to COVID too.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just, if you think about, I almost thought about bringing it up too, but there's so many graphs you want to fit in.
Yeah.
But if you can imagine that it was the peaks were very very sharp previously, and like Everest, right? And now they're a little bit more like an aged mountain, so a little bit flatter.
Okay, and then Michael Rochlow has a question, which I think probably direct to Iain to begin with, but others can weigh in. It has to do with the slow and weak rebound of the downtown office work and transit use in Toronto, compared to other cities, especially in Europe, where things are largely back to pre-pandemic levels. So he says 43% is a shockingly low number. Why is Toronto different? I know you have some thoughts on this, Iain.
Hi, Michael, and thank you for the question. I just came back from London, where I spent a good deal of time with the TfL people there, and we talked about European transit ridership. One of the big problems in the return to downtown office use, which is what we'd be measuring at 43%, is that nobody's doing it very well, period. I mean, if you look at what came out of New York throughout the whole pandemic, and it was always at 20%, never varied. Every time the people at Bloomberg commented on downtown return to the office, they always used the number 20%. And if you look at some of the card reader data from Kessel, you see a very patchy return, partly because Kessel doesn't operate in any of the major buildings in New York, period. So again, comparing cities is very, very difficult to do. However, I will tell you that the transit people tell us that the return to the core office in London is not too dissimilar than what it is here. In other words, if you look at Canary Wharf and if you look at the financial district, if you were to take your mind away from the 32 boroughs of London and just sort of put a line around where most of the office space is in London, you wouldn't see very dissimilar numbers at all. And the only other city which is similar to ours is San Francisco. And if you look at the relationship between where the office space is, the relationship to transit, and the type of work that's being done, it's really New York, San Francisco, and London, Paris to a certain degree, are very, very similar. The only other piece that's a little bit different in London and New York is tourism. And tourism is very hard to bifurcate when you've got tourists during the week that are using transit and going roughly to the same places a lot of those office buildings are. So those other kinds of data sources inflate without being able to dissect the use of transit in those areas.
Okay, thanks. So Habib in his comment said hybrid's here to stay, more or less. Yeah. Iain saying yes, but maybe not. So maybe you can get a little dialogue back and forth, maybe to Habib first to come back and see if we can have a little conversation about this.
Yes, I was waiting for that. I think people taste the benefit of telecommuting. If you look at early 90s, telecommuting was heavily promoted. And we always thought about telecommuting and flexible office hour are one of the two most dominant travel demand management tools. What COVID-19 did, it gave people the taste of telecommuting. And I would be to some extent supporting telecommuting to some level. It provides benefit to the families. I mean, the time you take to go to the office, if you can do the same job at home, there's no point of wasting that time. You can use that time eventually otherwise. So my understanding, the debate between whether people will telecommute or not will be the same debate between whether people will drive or not, whether people will take transit or not. People taste the advantage or whatever, the benefit of telecommuting. So it's gonna stay, to my feeling is that it may not stay at the level that we're seeing now, but to some extent, it will morph into a different pattern. And it's not only telecommuting, also the flexibility of working hours that comes along with that. You may commute for half an hour for a meeting and then go back and do the work at home. That's been another thing we didn't explore too much. So that is something to look at in future. But my feeling is that maybe we should accept the fact that it should be a part of the commuting pattern anyway.
Yeah. So Iain, any further comments on this? Or
Well, quite frankly, when we talk to the HR people, everything that Habib has been saying is just on the table. I think one of the things that's emerged in the last couple of weeks in particular, people are starting now to measure how young people are moving through the learning curve wherever they are. So for example, one of our biggest accountancy houses in downtown Toronto said to me, they believe that the process of bringing young accountants through their system is about 30% behind what it was pre-COVID. In other words, they're not learning at the same rate. And that has a lot to do with the fact that senior people aren't around to show the way, to put it in sort of old terms. But on the other hand, on the other side of the coin, I had a very interesting conversation a couple of weeks ago where the CEO was saying, look, there is value in remote work, particularly in people being able to organize their home lives better. So if the dishwasher is being delivered between 2 to 5, stay at home. There's a lot of advantages to remote work in the right application. But where I think the tension exists currently between employers and employees is how much and when. And I think the when is really the problem.
okay, so I'd like to now cycle right back to Wendy's very first comment. She raised the issue of congestion, and congestion used to be the big problem. Congestion, not just on the roads, but congestion on the TTC, right? I mean, Yonge Street subway just chock-a-block, and a lot of talk about, well, we have to be building all sorts of relief lines to offload Yonge. And so obviously congestion on Yonge isn't the immediate problem, but setting aside, if we can, that there's some revenue shortfalls with the current situation, shall we say, is there a potential, but given that the region is going to continue to grow by every projection, is some shifting in travel behavior, some working from home telecommuting, as Habib said, it was always promoted as a way of reducing the load on the system. Is this actually, and given that we haven't built a huge amount of new transit recently, I mean, there's some coming in now, is in some way this buying us some time or some space to accommodate the growth that's coming, particularly in terms of transit in the longer run? I don't know, that's a sort of an observation. I'm not sure what the question is, but does anybody have a response to that sort of an optimistic view that this is buying us some time to handle the growth that's coming?
If I want to add one point to Eric is also the congestion within the city state needs to be considered in context too, because we also lost a lot of capacities. The number of lanes we gave up for bike lanes and stuff no longer as before we had in pre-COVID. So
yeah.
So
roadway congestion is actually capacity.
So Eric, I think this is the biggest problem we have, frankly. We are growing. I just met with the Ministry of Economic Policy 3 weeks ago, looking at the growth projections. And honest to goodness, we don't realize how great this city is, how attractive it is, and how attractive it's going to be in the future. And if there's an immediate bailout for transit agencies, Metrolinx, TTC, and everyone is in growth, just in terms of their existing rolling stock. So I think we're going to see transit ridership get back to the levels a lot quicker than some people are speculating on, based entirely on growth. People are coming to this region, period. And we expect them to come to this region. That said, road congestion just can't manage that growth. We're at a stage where we're out of room on the roads. So if we don't double down on the kind of investment that's being proposed by the province right now and the TTC, some of the initiatives at Bloor and Young, et cetera, we've got to keep the pressure on, and we got to keep the foot down on the gas pedal, because we're going to wake up in 2 or 3 years from now and look around and say, whoa, we're right back to where we were before and then some.
Wendy, did you have anything to add?
I think Iain just summed it up really well. It's not, if anything, it maybe just gives some customers a bit of relief space-wise while we wait through this. But otherwise, the demand is coming, and we need to take the opportunity to prepare now.
Okay, I think my next question, shifting gears just a little bit, but it has to do with growth as well. Habib, you were commenting on what's happening on the residential side, the housing side, and yeah, certainly, very early days, everybody's moving out of town. Everybody's going to move out of town, and we actually looked at some cell phone data that tried to seemed to indicate as many people were moving into the downtown as were moving out over the first year. Nevertheless, I mean, and I certainly agree with your diagnosis. It'll be the housing prices that send people out. But what about office? What about jobs? What about office jobs? If people are, we're growing. I mean, not all of the growth is going to be in office type activities, but a lot of it is. Will some of those jobs, a lot of those jobs have suburbanized, as Iain well knows, over the last 20, 30 plus years. Airport Corporate Center up to Markham and so on. Is there any danger, quote unquote, that the suburbanization of jobs will occur, move to the extent that maybe it's moving closer to the extent that some people are suburbanizing, or will this, the vacancies downtown create a situation where the downtown will still be a very attractive place for at least certain types of office activities? Maybe throw that to Iain first, but welcome anybody else's comments on that.
I think the next 2 or 3 years is going to be messy, period. I think, we've got too much vacancy. In suburban areas, the vacancy, although it seems to be holding in Canada, is not holding in the States. Suburban vacancies are going up quite dramatically. I think there's going to be a very difficult period in time for the industry to adjust in Toronto, but it's really, as I said in my opening remarks, the canary in the coal mine is what are companies investing in? And every time you open the newspaper, you see a story about Shopify vacating their building. Well, people like to pick on one example. And that's an example where they didn't have much office space. They have virtually no office space in the UK and in Europe, Shopify, period. And didn't have before the pandemic, and they were very remote beforehand. We need to look at the financial services sector. We need to look at the bulk of our jobs, which are in the financial services sector and in the insurance sector, and see how the remote work, how hybrid works out over the next 2 or 3 years. The real estate industry will follow whatever happens on that front.
Habib, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that.
No,
you probably look mainly at the residential side.
Yeah, I haven't looked too much on the commercial side.
Yeah.
But if I take, go ahead, Sarah.
I was just saying, as much as we hear about the moving out of the city at the beginning of the pandemic, I think we recognize now, though, that a lot of those residential spaces have since refilled. And so whether jobs have suburbanized, the individuals the people are based in the city. And those people will need to have ways to move around. The reasons for their trips will continue, and they're going to be based on where they're living.
Yeah, we have a housing shortage, period. I mean, all you need to do is look at the rental rates right now in rental accommodation in the city, and it's getting to be really a major problem. The provincial government's attempting to address the supply side, but that's because there's demand. There are more and more people coming to this city. At the initial part of I talked to employers who said, oh, we lost our chief economist who moved down to Moncton for permanently at the beginning of the pandemic. Now we're trying to get them back, and it's going to cost us a lot of money because we got to relocate them back to Toronto. That's over with. I think the reason we have cities in the first place is to congregate. Culture, art, sporting events, everything to young people can socialize and so forth, and businesses thrive. That's what agglomeration is all about. That's coming back.
Yeah, I personally, I agree. I think the rationale of the city remains as the ultimate aggregator, and so hopefully it does survive. Habib raised both the threats and potential of TNC's transportation network companies, the Ubers, Lyfts, etc. of the world. One scenario is they cannibalize transit. The other scenario is they become supportive and solve first mile, last mile problems. Maybe I'll put Wendy just a little on the spot in terms of where the TTC thinks this is going, or what needs to be done in this area to move us more towards the good scenario rather than the bad scenario.
Yeah, I don't know if we have an official position on TTC and TNCs, but yeah, I guess, I've seen both sides of it. Certainly at CUDA, where TNCs are complementary to transit, where it seems like they're competitive. I think I think it's still really dependent on the individual city and the relationship that the city has with TNCs, right? The opportunity to leverage TNCs as a mobility partner, but also really as a mobility partner, and actually access the information and data that those providers gather can help be useful in understanding the needs of travelers within the city. In terms of competitiveness, I'm not an Uber user. I'm not a big Uber user, not just because I don't have too much use for it or too much opportunity for it. But I think of using it in Mexico City. I was in Mexico City trying all modes, trying everything that I could, including TNCs. And they don't move any faster. So if you want to be moving fast, if you want to be getting through somewhere, we need to be thinking about mass transit, right? And that's really where the bulk of people, or the majority of people, are going to be able to move quickly. It doesn't mean that there isn't a place and a space for these other modes, just as there is a place and space for active transportation. These are the cocktail of mobility that we want people to be able to have access to answer all of their mobility needs. But in terms of the kind of a big pinch on transit, I can't see it having a big one within Toronto.
Eric, the good news for Metrolinx is that people will need rapid transit to get long distances through the city. And I can see now, full disclosure, I was a director of Metrolinx, but I really think the rail corridors in this city are going to become critical to the way we move around, and integrating into, and I know Minister Cho spoke to this the other day, integrating the services so that people can move seamlessly and quickly between local distribution and long distance travel is going to drive all kinds of ridership back to Metrolinx.
Habib, any follow-up on your previous comments about how we move to the good side of the coin and the bad?
Can we charge some kind of curb space, right, in exchange for data?
No, I think we should open up to the opportunity to integrate this kind of service into transit, umbrella, under the umbrella of it. If you look at the range of trips where TNC becomes very attractive, the range is the mid-range, when short trips is too costly by TNC, over $10 or something. Long range costs too much. It's the mid-range where transit is also very competitive with the car. It's true that corridor-wise, some transit corridors in any city will be very highly feasible and competitive. I'm talking about underserved and under-demanded portion of it, and the vicious cycle of it. And if one service becomes the less of attractive of one, and then it drops out of the demand, and then go on and go on. And I think for better benefit to the society, if TTC is just an example, any transit agencies can work closely, at least monitor the pattern of TNC trips, and maybe use some sort of integration measures and provide better integration There could be many things. I don't want to mention a couple of here and anecdotally. Just make them symbiotic as much as possible before it gets out of hand. I mean, at some point, transit fights for small share of mode with other, while driving becomes prevalent. You know, what happened, bad thing during COVID, people get used to driving even more than they used to before. And people who didn't drive, they kind of justified the driving is okay. People who used to take transit, they also justified not taking transit is okay. And that attitude, that behavior has a stickiness, and that can stay.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we could carry on discussing this all afternoon and into the evening, but we're just about at the end of the hour. And I need to give Judy a minute or two to wrap things up. So thank you to the three panelists so much for your presentations and thoughtful discussion, giving us a lot to think about. So back to you, Judy, to wrap us up and take us to the hour.
And thank you for that. Thank you to our panelists, Habib, Wendy, Iain. Thank you so much for joining us. Eric for moderating. What a great job. Thank you so much. And thank you for coming. This was the first in a series of 6 sessions exploring the way forward. We will be back in 2 weeks for safeguarding reliable, sustainable supply chains. And every 2 weeks after that on Tuesday, 4 o'clock on Zoom. And we hope that you will join us. Registration for all these events is open. They're free, of course. But to get the link, you're going to have to register. You'll find these advertised on Mobility Network. You'll get reminders if you subscribe to our weekly newsletter. And you can also subscribe to our weekly newsletter on the website. And you can always find out more by contacting us. Thank you ever so much for joining us. And we hope you'll join us again. And until then, I don't know, get out and about.